America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
Hello fellow YouTubers, I'm Agent.exe. Welcome to another episode of Armchair Journalism, where we look at different issues discussed in the news media, with credible cited sources and with no added biased narrative or influence from sponsors. In this episode, we're going to cover something a bit different. We are going to take a look at the United States war on drugs and answer some basic questions like, what is the US government doing to stop the flow of drugs? What have they done in the past? And what groups are partially responsible for the rampant usage of drugs in the US? The war on drugs in the US began on June 17, 1971, when President Richard Nixon declared drug abuse to be public enemy number one and increased federal funding for drug control agencies and drug treatment efforts. It's hard to believe that the war is 48 years old. Right about now, it should be getting a tattoo, an earring, a muscle car, and leaving us for a younger country. There are two acts that predate Nixon's declaration that began the shift of the US's approach to the prohibition of drugs. The two acts were the 1951 Boggs Act and the 1956 Narcotic Control Act. The Boggs Act established mandatory minimum sentencing for some drug offenders, while the Narcotic Control Act increased penalties for drug offenses and established the death penalty for drug dealers selling heroin to youth. On October 27, 1970, Nixon signed into law the Controlled Substance Act, or the CSA, which was enacted by Congress as Title II of the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act of 1970. The CSA laid the legal groundwork that allowed the federal government to oversee the manufacturing, dissemination, and possession of controlled substances. On June 17, 1971, Nixon addressed Congress and declared, "As long as there is a demand, there will be those willing to take the risks of meeting the demand. Forget a higher than average inflation rate and rising unemployment rate, because drugs were the only problem America faced at the time." Moving on, controlled substances were organized into 5 schedules in consonance with how life-threatening they could be, the likelihood of developing an addiction, and their potential for abuse, and whether the drug had justifiable medicinal use. On January 28, 1972, the Office for Drug Abuse Law Enforcement was established by Nixon through an executive order to enforce the CSA. The CSA also provided federal funding for drug abuse treatment programs and got rid of most of the mandatory minimum sentencing for drug offenses. Offenders would have cheered, but their hands were still cuffed behind their backs. From 1972 to 1973, the Odell performed 6,000 drug arrests in 18 months. The majority of those arrested were black. Now, I'm not saying they were profiling. I'm also not saying that. It's almost as if this war on drugs was just a thinly veiled war on something else certain Americans had an issue with at the time. On July 1st, 1973, the DEA was established due to an executive order by Nixon on July 6, 1973. The order consolidated Odell and the other drug enforcement agencies into one unified drug law enforcement agency. Fast forward to the years of the Reagan administration, specifically on March 6, 1981, during a news conference. President Reagan shares much of the same views of Nixon. He states, "It's far more effective if you take the customers away than if you try to take the customers away from those who want to be customers." Translation: we hear your logic about reducing demand. So instead of cost-effective demand reduction programs, we're just going to waste your tax dollars by treating them like violent criminals. So it wasn't all that surprising when, just like Nixon, he continued to treat drug abuse in the country as a matter of criminal justice and not healthcare. Additionally, he continued the efforts of previous presidents and trying to win the drug war by focusing on the supply side of the drug trade. On October 27, 1986, President Reagan signed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, creating new mandatory minimum sentences for first-time offenders who possessed any amount of crack, which increased the number of people incarcerated in federal prisons. You know, the old, let's just throw everyone in jail instead of focusing on treatment and education programs approach. The act also initiated penalties for possession of any controlled substance and allowed illicit drug analogs to be treated as a Schedule I drug. On November 18, 1988, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1988 was signed into law by President Ronald Reagan, which allowed for the imprisonment of drug possessors that had more than 5 grams of crack cocaine to serve a minimum of 5 years. If an offender had a prior conviction for crack cocaine possession, they would receive a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years for possession of 3 grams of cocaine base. If an offender had 2 or more convictions for possession of crack cocaine, they would receive a minimum of 5 years in prison. Of course, none of this could have possibly caused prison overcrowding that still persists to this day, less money for public safety programs, and wasted tax dollars that could have gone towards the actual problem. During his first 5 years of office, Reagan doubled down on his highly effective approach of not fixing the problem, by strengthening drug law enforcement. He accomplished this by creating new mandatory minimum sentencing and expanding civil asset forfeiture of cash and real estate for drug offenses, policies far more detrimental to poor minorities than any other sector affected by these new laws. The Reagan administration also blocked the expansion of syringe exchange programs, effectively contributing to the increase of HIV cases due to the usage of contaminated syringes. I guess he was figuring that drug abusers would just Darwin themselves out. At this point, drug usage steadily rose alongside overdose deaths and gang-related violence. According to the Department of Justice statistics, the tough-on-crime reforms caused the national prison population to skyrocket from 740,000 to 1.6 million between 1985 and 1995. On September 13, 1994, President Bill Clinton signed the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, which served to amplify the number of people in prison. Provisions in the bill included the 3 strikes rule, which mandated that if a criminal received 2 felony convictions for a violent or drug offense, he would receive a life sentence following 1 more conviction for an offense that was violent. Some provisions expanded federal mandatory minimum sentences and required states to adopt the Truth in Sentencing laws to receive federal funding. The TIS laws required that persons convicted of violent crimes serve not less than 85% of the sentence imposed. During Clinton's term, incarceration due to drug offenses increased and continued to disproportionately affect impoverished minority communities. It's staggering to think about how these powerful men continued to just slap band-aids on the real problem. On April 9, 2008, the Second Chance Act was signed into law by George W. Bush to help reduce recidivism by providing grants to state and local governments. Those grants were partially used to treat mental illness and drug addiction. On August 3, 2010, President Barack Obama signed the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010 into law, which reduced the disparity in sentencing for possession of crack cocaine and powder-based cocaine. The weight ratio was 100-1 before the act and 18-1 after the act. For those who don't know, the government treated possession of crack and cocaine differently. For example, if you were charged with possession of 1 gram of crack cocaine, you would receive the same penalties for possession of 100 grams of cocaine. The act also eliminated the minimum 5-year sentence for possession of crack cocaine and increased penalties for high-level drug traffickers. On December 21, 2018, President Donald Trump signed the First Step Act into law. This law extended the scope of the Fair Sentencing Act and was applied retroactively to prisoners incarcerated before 2010. It also gave judges more leeway in sentencing below the mandatory minimum, reformed the 3 strikes law, provided funding for evidence-based treatment for opioid and heroin abuse, and reauthorized the Second Chance Act. Surprisingly, a reasonable act hidden away behind his outward nonsense on social media. The changes to the 3 strikes law included reducing a life sentence to 25 years if the sentence resulted from having 3 or more felony convictions, and having the second strike carry a mandatory minimum of 15 years. What was the final result after passing all this legislation to fight the drug war? The US has spent an estimated $1 trillion since 1971 on the drug war and has incarcerated 74,458 people in federal prisons for drug offenses this year, contributing to the problems associated with mass incarceration. If only that money went into education and healthcare, but that would make too much sense, right? National and prison gangs in the US, as well as darknet markets, are still profiting from drug prohibition. Gang violence in different cities across the US is causing a rise in homicides due to disputes over drug-selling territories. For example, between May 31st and June 3rd, 2019, 52 people were shot and 8 people were killed in Chicago. Chicago police have stated that most of the violence was fueled by drugs and petty fights. There are some startling patterns associated with the drug war. If you take a look at this line chart, you'll observe a rise in prisoners sentenced to at least 1 year for drug offenses in federal prisons between 1980 and 2017, with a slight decline beginning in 2011. Similarly, if you look at this line chart, you'll see a rise in prisoners sentenced to at least 1 year for drug offenses in state prisons between 1980 and 2016, with a decline beginning in 2006. In the next line chart, you can see how many prisoners were sentenced to at least 1 year for drug offenses according to race in state prisons between 1980 and 2016. You'll notice that black people have been incarcerated the most between 1980 and 2015. And finally, we have this line chart of some lines, which you would have to snort to understand why this drug war is still going on. In all seriousness though, although there has been some progress in reducing the number of people incarcerated, there are still many people incarcerated for drug possession and other related offenses. It's also important to add that although it may seem like locking up drug dealers is a good idea, it does little to prevent the illicit drug trade in or out of the prison system. Which brings us to our next topic. Which gangs participate the most in the illicit drug trade in the US? According to the DEA's 2018 National Threat Assessment, the Sureños, Norteños, and Bloods ranked highest as the most active gangs with drug trafficking organization alliances, while the Sinaloa cartel had the strongest relationship with gangs throughout the United States. These three gangs have been classified by the DEA as national gangs. The Bloods are a confederation of independent gangs, or sets that individually contain a paramilitary structure, as well as a mafia-inspired hierarchy. They are primarily an African-American street gang that was created in South Central Los Angeles, California in 1972 by Sylvester Scott and Benson Owens. They are identified by their red and black colored attire, tattoos, and by the specific hand signs they use to communicate. They also mark their territory with graffiti, which displays their name in some form. The current size of the gang is estimated to be between 20,000 and 25,000. In the 1980s, the Bloods began to direct their attention to drug dealing during the crack epidemic. The revenue from dealing drugs allowed them to expand to major cities like New York. The Sureños, or Southerners in English, was founded in 1968 as a result of the war between the Mexican Mafia and Nuestra Familia and California's prison system. With regards to the overall structure, there doesn't seem to be a formal one for the Sureños. The Sureños have a designated shot caller that directly communicates with the Mexican Mafia. The Sureños are often identified by their blue attire, tattoos, and hand signs. They also mark their territory with graffiti that displays a form of their name and the number 13. A few members have direct links to Mexican DTOs and negotiate on behalf of the Mexican Mafia as well as their own gang. The Mexican Mafia is a prison gang that uses Sureños as foot soldiers, which brings us to their origin. Sometime in July 1957, the Mexican Mafia was established by Luis Flores at the Duel Vocational Institution. The Mexican Mafia's primary source of income comes from extortion of drug distributors and distributing drugs themselves. The Mexican Mafia has 350 to 400 members that control over 50,000 to 75,000 gang members and associates. The Mexican Mafia themselves have a paramilitary structure that includes a president, vice president, regional generals, lieutenants, sergeants, and soldiers. They are a horizontally and vertically structured organization with no single leader at the national level. There seems to be one president assigned per territory. The last gang we will be covering are the Norteños, or Northerners in English, which formed in San Quentin State Prison in 1968. The Norteños are often identified by their red attire, tattoos, and hand signals. They also mark their territory with graffiti that displays some form of their name and the number 14. The Norteños are organized into cliques and have a paramilitary structure, with the general being the highest rank. One of the primary sources of income for the Norteños is selling drugs. Additionally, they are run by the prison gang Nuestra Familia, or NF. The NF was formed in 1968 by Gonzalo Hernandez, Freddy Gonzalez, John Valdez, and Bruce Morgan at the San Quentin State Prison in San Quentin, California. In the order from greatest to least amount of power, the hierarchy includes La Mesa, which consists of an elected 3-member board, Category 3, which includes members that take on a managerial role, Category 2, which is made up of members that have proven their loyalty, and Category 1, which includes recruits and new members. Currently, there are about 1,000 to 2,000 NF members, which control over 10,000 norteños. Although there is a set structure, there seems to be only one member on La Mesa presently, and his name is David D.C. Cervantes. Now I know what you might be thinking. Adrian, those gangs aren't the typical criminal organizations we're used to. No, they're not. And compared to the next group involved in the drug trade, they were Boy Scouts. We will be taking a look at Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family. Who is Purdue Pharma? In a nutshell, they are to the opioid crisis what the Medellin cartel was to the cocaine craze in the 80s. In 1952, Arthur, Mortimer, and Raymond Sackler bought a pharmaceutical company named Purdue Pharma, based in Connecticut. In 1996, Purdue Pharma introduced the opioid pain medication Oxycontin. Oxycontin is a slow-released form of oxycodone used to treat severe pain. Purdue capitalized on the chronic pain movement by misleading physicians into believing Oxycontin was less addictive than other opioids on the market, exaggerated the benefits it had, and told physicians that they were violating their Hippocratic oath, as well as letting their patients down by not prescribing opioids for pain. When promoting Oxycontin, Purdue took advantage of the misconception that Oxycontin had less potential for abuse. In 2001, the annual sales of Oxycontin had risen beyond $1 billion. In 1997, the annual number of Oxycontin prescriptions written by physicians was around 670,000, which then skyrocketed to about 6.2 million in 2002. Because why have a dealer on every corner when you can have doctors do it for you? On May 10, 2007, Purdue Pharma, alongside 3 executives, pleaded guilty to federal charges of misbranding a drug with intention to mislead the public regarding Oxycontin's addictiveness between 1995 and 2001. Purdue agreed to pay $634.5 million in penalties and signed a 5-year corporate integrity agreement with the US government. However, this didn't stop the revenue stream, as Purdue reportedly made $3.1 billion from Oxycontin in 2010. In 2015, it was reported by Forbes that the Sackler family made approximately $15 billion, primarily from Oxycontin. In 2018, Purdue stopped promoting the drug and cut the remaining members of its sales force, and the last Sackler family member on the Purdue board left. According to a recent report, however, Purdue's sister company, Mundi Pharma, continues to falsely advertise one of their opioid products in Australia. Because this cartel doesn't die, it diversifies. Additionally, the Sacklers have not cut ties with Purdue and continue to own the company through family trusts. On September 11, 2019, it was reported by multiple news outlets that Purdue Pharma had reached a settlement with 23 states and more than 2,000 cities and counties, all of whom sued Purdue Pharma over its role in the opioid epidemic. The settlement calls for Purdue to pay $12 billion. 3 of that $12 billion will be coming from the Sackler family, from selling Mundi Pharma. The Sackler family will also relinquish control of Purdue. On September 15, 2019, Purdue filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. This will allow Purdue to turn its company into a public benefit trust that will use its profits to pay plaintiffs. Purdue will also be donating medicine for addiction treatment and overdose reversal. However, the settlement does not include an admission of guilt. Purdue is by no means the only drug firm to profit from selling opioids. Johnson & Johnson also played a part when they introduced their fentanyl patch, and Mallinckrodt Pharmaceuticals, Spec GX, Actavis Pharma, and Power Pharmaceutical together control 88% of the US market for opioids. The list of culprits also include corrupt drug distributors, pharmacies, and doctors. Distributors like Rochester Drug Co-op Inc. distributed opioids they knew were being used and sold for non-medicinal purposes, and did not report these purchases to the DEA. Doctors like Dr. Alex Coffey prescribed Oxycontin without medical necessity in exchange for money. Pharmacies like Dayton Primary and Urgent Care Center Inc. knowingly filled prescriptions they knew were prescribed out of no medical necessity. So how does the opioid crisis connect to the drug war? Well, once patients become addicted and either can't afford or receive a prescription for opioids they were previously prescribed, they turn to crime to purchase drugs like heroin, and more recently, fentanyl. The use of drugs like heroin is determined by its availability and low cost. This provides drug dealers ample opportunity to sell to their target demographic, which in this case would mainly include people in impoverished communities. Ultimately, cartels profit from the drug money accumulated by gangs, while those addicted to these illicit drugs are imprisoned and aren't given the help they need often enough. What is the cost in human lives due to the opioid epidemic? In 2017, there were 70,237 drug overdose deaths, and at least 15,000 were heroin related. Although preliminary data shows that painkiller overdose deaths went from 15,000 to approximately 13,000 in 2018, overdose deaths linked to synthetic opioids such as fentanyl increased from 29,000 in 2017 to about 32,000 in 2018. It is clear that unrestricted access is not the answer, but neither is drug prohibition. The healthy medium would be legalization or decriminalization with strict government regulation. I already talked a lot about legalization when I talked about the drug war in Colombia. However, decriminalization is also a good option that has seen some positive results in Portugal. These results include a decrease in HIV infections and drug-related deaths. The government's regulation intensity needs to be proportional to each drug's lethality and potential for abuse. This means that every drug should be treated differently. An age restriction could also prove beneficial. To keep it short, to help end the war on drugs, I think it is also necessary for the US government to regulate the marketing and commercialization of drugs by drug firms, like we have for tobacco companies. If some currently illicit drugs are legalized, then drug firms need harsher penalties, like prison sentences or heftier fines for false advertising. Furthermore, they should use the money from fines to invest in research for addiction and establishing addiction treatment centers. In my opinion, I believe that people who are addicted should be offered more assistance to enable rehabilitation, rather than be punished for simple possession of the drug they are addicted to. Lastly, I believe more supervised injection facilities should be established and allowed to legally run to stop the spread of diseases and prevent overdoses. That being said, you, the viewer, don't have to wait for changes to happen. You can aid in ending the drug war now. Currently, there are 2 forms of legislation that are currently being proposed that can be one of many vital incremental steps to ending the drug war. The first is the Marijuana Justice Act, and the second is the Comprehensive Addiction Resources Emergency Act, or the CARE Act. The CARE Act would enable $100 billion to be used over 10 years to battle drug addiction, channeling money to cities, states, and counties that have been affected the most by the opioid epidemic. And it will provide funding for organizations that will support drug addiction treatment, harm reduction services, and prevention programs. The Marijuana Freedom and Opportunity Act will remove the classification of marijuana as a scheduled substance at the federal level while helping communities affected by failed marijuana laws. You can support these acts by visiting the following website. Instructions on how to support these acts will be in the description. In conclusion, the U.S.'s current strategy to combat illegal drug trafficking and drug use focuses on dealing with the supply portion of the illicit drug market, while trying to avoid handling the demand portion, as it did in the past. In attempting to circumvent the law of supply and demand, the U.S. has allowed criminal syndicates to proliferate, the rise of untreated addiction, and many other negative, possibly unintended consequences. Additionally, although gangs are primarily the ones dealing drugs, they are not alone in supplying them. Corrupt drug manufacturers, drug distributors, pharmacies, and doctors all share responsibility. Unlike most wars, this war's enemy is a global commodity that affects the U.S.'s international and national politics, and seemingly has no end and no winner. The only way to begin the process to end the war on drugs has to start with the government taking the first incremental step towards treating drug use as a matter of public health, and focusing on both the supply and demand of the illicit drug trade. Thanks for watching Armchair Journalism. If you like this content and would like to see more, feel free to like, subscribe, and click that bell icon so that you can be notified whenever I upload. Also, do not hesitate to leave your thoughts on the drug war in the comment section below.